Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
They tell their friends I cut contact because I'm sensitive, that I've always been a little dramatic, that I can't handle stress and lash out at people who love me. That's their story, the version they tell over wine with their church friends or during brunch at Caleb's lake house while looking out over the water like their family is some Norman Rockwell painting. But the truth doesn't care about their storytelling. The truth is simpler. I was getting sicker by the day, my body failing in ways that terrified me, and my parents, my own flesh and blood, chose to spend thousands of dollars building my brother's dream getaway instead of even asking if I was okay. They didn't ignore me out of malice. That might have been easier to forgive. They ignored me because they never really saw me in the first place. I used to think the idea of a golden child was just something bitter siblings made up to excuse their own failures. But when you're standing in your bathroom holding a fistful of your own hair, clumps of it falling out like autumn leaves, and your mom tells you to try yoga, you start to realize that maybe you're not just imagining the favoritism. Maybe it's been real all along. Caleb has always been the center of their universe, sunshine wrapped in a varsity Letterman jacket, back when that meant something. He was the kind of kid that drew people to him. Big smile, always charming, even when he was lying through his teeth. He could wreck Dad's car, get arrested for shoplifting, drop out of community college, and still, they'd find a way to blame someone else. He just needs direction, Mom would say, like he wasn't already a grown-ass man with 2 kids he barely called and a girlfriend he treated like an afterthought. I, on the other hand, had to be perfect. Not good, perfect. I had to get straight A's, go to college on scholarship, become a nurse, never call home unless I had something upbeat to report, and, even then, keep it short. Because if I complained, even a little, I was whining. If I asked for help, I was being dramatic. And if I pushed back, well, then I was the difficult one. So I kept it all in. Every ache, every dizzy spell, every time I couldn't feel my fingers after a long shift. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that I was pushing too hard, that I just needed more sleep or better vitamins. I told myself all the things they would have said, because their voices had lived in my head for so long. I didn't know where they ended and I began. It started small. Tingling in my legs that wouldn't go away. Stiff joints in the morning. Then came the fatigue, the kind that makes you wonder if your body is secretly running marathons while you sleep. I stopped going out. I stopped answering calls. I stopped pretending everything was fine. When I finally dragged myself to a doctor, they ordered tests. Lots of them. Blood work, MRIs, more blood work. Words like autoimmune, systemic inflammation started floating around. I told Mom on a Wednesday night, half hoping she'd hear the fear in my voice. She was distracted, fumbling with her Bluetooth in the car, on her way to meet Dad and Caleb at a dinner with the contractor they'd hired for the lake house remodel. Are you sure it's not just stress, honey? You've always been so tightly wound. I was silent. I knew right then that she hadn't heard a word I said. Not really. Caleb, of course, was in the middle of another reinvention. This time it was some real estate fantasy, flipping a lakefront house for profit and turning it into a retreat space. He talked about it like it was his calling. Never mind that he'd left 2 jobs in the past year, hadn't paid child support in 3 months, and still asked Dad to cover his credit card bills. But they were all in on his dream. Dad even cashed out part of his 401k to help Caleb get started. They spent weekends up there, painting walls, picking out light fixtures, talking about Caleb's vision. And me? I was running on fumes, waking up with swollen joints, losing my balance in the shower, and pretending to be okay so they wouldn't accuse me of making it about me. I remember the night I collapsed vividly. It was a Sunday just after 10 p.m. I had just come off a 12-hour shift at the hospital. My legs were numb, and my chest felt tight. I reached for a glass of water and felt the world tilt. My knees hit the floor before I could catch myself. My face slammed into the cabinet. And then nothing. Just blackness. I woke up in the ER the next morning. One of my neighbors had heard a thud and found me unconscious. My chart said low blood pressure, severe dehydration, autoimmune flare. A young doctor with kind eyes sat at the foot of my bed and said words like systemic lupus and kidney involvement. My first call was to my parents. I still wanted them there. Still thought they'd come running. But when I finally got through, Mom said they were already halfway to the lake house to meet a plumber and asked if I could keep her updated by text. That was the moment I stopped hoping. Not because they didn't love me, no, love wasn't the issue. The problem was they didn't see me. Not really. They saw Caleb's potential, his struggles, his triumphs, even when they were imaginary. But me? I was the background music. The support staff. The emergency contact they assumed wouldn't actually have an emergency. So I laid there in that hospital bed, for pumping into my arm, trying to remember the last time either of them had asked how I was doing without looking at their watch or checking their phone. And I couldn't. Not once. Not in over 35 years. Here's a question for you, just to sit with. Have you ever been so invisible in your own family that when you finally disappear, no one even notices right away? Because that was me. And soon, they'd notice. Just not the way they expected. The irony of sitting in a hospital room, tethered to a maze of tubes and monitors, while your parents are picking out backsplash tile for your brother's wet bar, is the kind of bitter that doesn't leave your mouth for weeks. It lingers like the aftertaste of burnt coffee or cheap bourbon, a reminder that no matter how much pain you're in, some people will still find a way to make it about themselves. I remember watching the fluorescent lights flicker above me, listening to the steady beep of my heart monitor, and thinking, not crying, not screaming, just thinking that maybe if I had been louder about what was happening to me, they would have taken it seriously. Or maybe they still would have dismissed me, chalking it up to another one of my so-called episodes, the way Mom always used to when I had anxiety attacks as a teenager and she'd wave me off with, "You're not broken, Rachel, you're just emotional." When they finally showed up, nearly 18 hours after I was admitted, they looked rushed. Not worried, not even especially surprised, just inconvenienced, like I dragged them out of a matinee. My mother had on one of those tight little blazers she only wore when she wanted to look like she was handling things, and my dad had dust on his shoes, probably from trudging around Caleb's property, where construction was finally underway. They brought me a bottle of green juice and one of those stupid glossy magazines about home renovations, like I was on a spa retreat and not in the middle of a full-body breakdown. I don't remember the exact words they said, because my brain was somewhere between foggy and furious, but I do remember how quickly the topic shifted from my blood tests to the contractor who was giving them trouble about the plumbing permits, and how Caleb was stressed, but staying so positive, and how they had to drive back before rush hour because there was a design meeting early the next morning. I lay there, nodding, too tired to fight, while my insides were screaming for just one moment of acknowledgement, one sentence, one look, one genuine, "Are you okay?" That never came. And then my dad said something I will never, ever forget. He leaned over, patted my leg like I was a neighbor's kid with a scrape, and muttered, "Just don't let your mind get the better of you. The body follows the mind, Ratch." Then he stood up, stretched, and added, "You're strong. You'll get through this." And, just like that, they were gone. The door clicked shut behind them, and I swear the room got colder. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stared at the ceiling for hours, feeling like I'd died and been reincarnated as a ghost in my own life. The nurses were kinder than my parents. The young intern who brought me my meds asked if I needed someone to talk to. I said no, not because I didn't need someone, but because I didn't have the energy to explain 36 years of erasure to a stranger with kind eyes and a clipboard. After I was discharged, I moved back into my apartment, which now felt more like a sickbay than a home. I had to quit my job, something that gutted me more than I expected. I loved being a nurse, not because of the prestige or the pay, God knows neither were great, but because it gave me a sense of purpose. I had spent years taking care of people, holding hands in trauma rooms, whispering comfort to dying patients, navigating chaos with a calm voice and steady hands. And now, when I was the one who needed care, I was alone. I tried reaching out to my parents once more, not because I wanted to, but because some desperate part of me still believed they might suddenly become the people I needed. I asked if they could come by, maybe just for dinner. Mom said they were slammed between Caleb's project and Dad's new medications. She offered to have food delivered instead. We'll make it a little surprise, she said brightly, like sending takeout was the same as sitting at a table and asking your daughter how she's surviving her body turning against her. A week later, I saw photos online from Caleb's housewarming party, his pre-opening gathering, as he called it. Champagne, charcuterie boards, matching lake towels, string lights that twinkled over the dock like a scene from a catalog. I wasn't invited. Not even as a courtesy. Not even after all the years I'd driven him home drunk from parties, bailed him out of his second DUI, covered for him when he forgot Mom's birthday, patched up the holes he left in everyone else's lives. In one of the videos posted by one of Caleb's friends, my father stands up, glass in hand, and says to Caleb, who had the vision, the drive, and the courage to make this dream happen, "This house is proof that when we believe in someone, amazing things happen." I watched that toast 10 times. Maybe 20. My father, my blood, talking about Caleb like he was some kind of prophet, like this house was a cathedral built on faith and perseverance, and not a monument to every unchecked failure my brother had ever committed. I stared at his face, searching for some flicker of doubt, some moment where he'd falter, realize the gravity of what he was saying, but it wasn't there. He believed every word. Because in his eyes, Caleb was the dreamer. Caleb was the legacy. Caleb was the future. And me? I was the noise in the background. Static. Clutter. An inconvenient subplot. That night, I sat in my dark apartment, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled like the hospital, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to ask again. Not for love. Not for attention. Not even for basic decency. I was done begging to be seen by people who only had eyes for a version of family that didn't include me unless I was quiet, smiling, and out of the way. Because here's what they never understood, and what they were about to find out: silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes silence is the sound of someone loading the last bullet before they finally take aim. It's a strange thing, the moment you finally stop waiting for the people who hurt you to notice what they've done. It doesn't come with a dramatic scene or a slammed door or even a long, cathartic scream into the night. No, for me, it came quietly, sometime between refilling my prescription alone at the pharmacy and sitting in the living room watching dust settle on a get well card from a coworker I barely knew better than my own parents. It was then, in that thick, airless moment of isolation, that I realized something I should have seen years ago. Some people will never show up for you, not because they can't, not even because they won't, but because they've never had to. And the idea that you might expect it now feels to them like an inconvenience rather than a responsibility. After the party, I didn't speak to my parents for nearly 3 months. Not a call, not a text, not even a holiday check-in. It wasn't planned silence, not some protest or punishment. It was simply a withdrawal, like a wounded animal retreating into its cave to lick its wounds and figure out how to keep breathing without the pack it thought it belonged to. And in that silence, something in me began to shift. It wasn't healing, exactly, not yet, but it was space, and in that space, I began to see the patterns more clearly, like stains on a wall that had always been there, but only became visible when the light hit them at the right angle. My life had been a series of quiet sacrifices, carefully performed backstage while the spotlight always shone on my brother, and now, stripped of performance, stripped of the need to be seen or applauded or even remembered, I began to imagine a life where I no longer had to be anyone's disappointment. And then, as if on cue, Caleb managed to do what Caleb always does: implode in spectacular fashion. I got the news not from my family, of course, but from a local news alert shared by someone in my lupus support group, because even though they didn't know the details of my family, they'd read enough of my online posts to recognize Caleb's name when it popped up in a police blotter. Apparently, our golden boy had gotten into a brawl outside a bar near the lake house, something about an ex-girlfriend, a drunken accusation, and a punch that sent another man's head into a brick wall. Suddenly, Caleb's shiny new brand, the one he was building online as a motivational speaker/real estate guru, was in jeopardy. His face was plastered on local TV, his sponsors quietly pulled out, and the retreat bookings for his precious lake house dropped to 0 overnight. And just like that, my parents remembered I existed. The first message came from my mom, a chirpy, Overly sweet text that read, "Hey honey. Just checking in, hope you're feeling okay. Let's catch up soon." It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so pathetic. No mention of Caleb, no mention of the arrest, no mention of the fact that they had spent nearly $70,000 helping him build a fantasy that was now crumbling into lakefront debris. Just that cheerful lie of normalcy, like I might not have seen the news, like I might be naive enough to think her sudden interest had nothing to do with their little empire starting to crack at the foundation. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because while they were dealing with the fallout of their bad investment, I was quietly building something of my own, something that didn't need their attention, their approval, or their checkbooks. It had started as a journal, just a way to get the bitterness out of my bloodstream before it turned me toxic. But over time, those entries began to take shape, to harden into something real, something powerful. I began writing late into the night raw, unapologetic essays about what it means to be the overlooked child, the emotional mule, the afterthought in a family obsessed with appearances. I posted them under a pseudonym at first, just to test the waters, and to my shock, they spread like wildfire. One essay in particular, titled "When Your Family Only Calls After a Mugshot," blew up on social media, shared by thousands of people who saw themselves in my story, who commented with lines like, "I thought I was the only one," or "This made me cry in my car." One night, I got an email from a small indie publishing house in Oregon. They wanted to talk. They weren't promising anything huge, no six-figure advance, no guaranteed bestseller, but they believed in the voice, they said, and they thought the story needed to be told. They asked if I'd be willing to write a memoir, something personal, something raw and honest, something with teeth. I said yes before I even finished the sentence. And I knew, in that moment, exactly what I would call it: the daughter they forgot. But I wasn't done. Some part of me still wanted them to feel it, not just the loss of my affection or my phone calls, but the weight of what they had done, the years they had ignored me, the sickness they had dismissed, the care they had withheld while they poured everything into a son who couldn't stay out of his own way. So, one cold afternoon in November, I took a trip out to the lake house. They weren't there, it was midweek, and Caleb was busy trying to scrape together another comeback tour on Instagram Live. The property was quiet, surrounded by fallen leaves and that eerie silence that creeps in when a place is loved by the wrong people. I walked through the yard, around the side, and found the crawl space where they kept some of the old renovation materials. I pried up one of the floorboards, the one near the back porch where they had their first celebratory dinner, and slipped a note inside. Nothing poetic, nothing dramatic. Just a folded page with 6 words written in my neat, careful handwriting: "This house was built on my bones." Let them find it years from now. Let it haunt them in quiet moments. And when my book finally came out, yes, I used their real names. No, I didn't warn them. I made sure they got the first copy, hand-delivered in a padded envelope with no return address. I didn't need to say anything. They would know. Because sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't loud or flashy or cruel. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply telling the truth, clearly and without apology, and letting it sit there like a mirror they can't look away from. And the truth was this: I had spent my whole life being the one who carried everyone else. Now I was finally learning how to carry myself, and I wasn't about to hand that power back. Not for anything. There's a certain kind of silence that settles after you finally tell your story, not the silence of indifference or ignorance, but a deep, echoing stillness that follows the thunder of truth being spoken into a space that never expected it to exist. It's not peace exactly, and it's certainly not closure. Those things are myths we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night, but it is something heavier, more potent, like the pause between a match being struck and the fire catching. The moment my book went live, the moment those pages, my pages, were finally released into the world bearing my truth in ink and pain, I didn't feel vindicated or excited or proud. I felt calm, deadly calm. Like I'd just dropped a stone into the middle of a still lake and was waiting, with perfect patience, to see where the ripples would hit the shore. The reaction, as it turned out, came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, my phone lit up with notifications from people I didn't know, women mostly, scattered across the country in small towns and suburbs, some with grown children of their own. Some still trying to escape the shadows of the families they were born into. They wrote things like, "You said what I've never been able to," or "I've been invisible for so long I forgot what it felt like to be seen." And those words, strangers' words, meant more to me than anything my family had ever said, because they came without obligation or guilt or performance. They came from people who understood, not because I forced them to, but because truth recognizes truth, even when it's bruised and angry and unpretty. The real eruption didn't happen until the podcast. A friend of mine, someone I'd met through an online chronic illness forum, had connected me to a producer at a mid-sized but fiercely loyal podcast called Daughters Who Were Never Chosen, a raw, unscripted series that featured women telling the stories they were never allowed to tell at the dinner table. I agreed to go on, not because I wanted more attention, but because I wanted my voice, to exist somewhere outside the filtered lens of my family's projections. So I sat in my small apartment, microphone in front of me, heart pounding in my chest, and I told the story from beginning to end. The years of being second best, the endless sacrifices unnoticed, the collapse in my kitchen, the sterile hospital room, the green juice pity visit, the lake house toasts, the headline-making arrest, the silence, the book, the revenge. It wasn't a sob story. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for sympathy. I told it straight, with a calmness that only comes from having burned through all the screaming inside yourself. And when it aired, just 40 minutes of my voice, low and deliberate and sharp as glass, something shifted in the air. The episode hit a nerve. It was shared thousands of times, discussed in forums, dissected on TikTok, and quoted in articles about emotional neglect and family trauma. People began to post photos of themselves standing in front of their family homes, captioned with lines from my book. One woman tattooed a line from the final chapter, "Some daughters aren't lost, they were just never seen." It was surreal, not because I wanted to be famous or followed, but because, for the first time in my life, the silence around me wasn't empty, it was full of voices echoing mine. And then, just as I expected, the messages came. First, from Caleb, of all people, as if his ego couldn't tolerate not being centered for long. He sent a long, meandering email, equal parts apology and self-defense, painting himself as the victim of our parents' manipulation, trying to rewrite the past by claiming he never asked them for anything, that he didn't even want the lake house, that it was all Dad's idea, and that he was struggling too during my health crisis, but didn't know how to help. It would have been funny if it weren't so predictably pathetic. Caleb had always had a way of making everyone else's pain orbit around his own narrative, as though empathy was only possible if it somehow benefited him. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. His letter wasn't for me, it was for his conscience, and I had no intention of feeding it. Then came my parents. At first, just my mother, who called late one night and left a voicemail that I didn't listen to for days. When I finally did, I sat still, every muscle in my body taut, as her voice stammered through the static, trying to sound calm, trying to sound rational, but cracking every few sentences. "I don't know when you started hating us," she said, as if I hadn't handed her a decade's worth of clues. I wish you'd told us how bad it was." That sentence, more than anything else, made me laugh, because I had told them dozens of times in different ways, in different tones, with different levels of urgency, and every time, they had waved it away like an inconvenient draft from a window they couldn't be bothered to shut. They wanted to meet. Said they missed me. Said they felt blindsided. Said they just wanted to understand. And I'll admit it, some small, aching part of me almost considered it. Some leftover hope, buried deep beneath all the wounds and walls and ash, flickered for just a second. But then I remembered the woman in the hospital bed, alone. I remembered the dinner parties I was never invited to. I remembered the way my father's voice sounded in that video, so proud, so certain, so unaware that he was toasting the beginning of my departure. So I agreed to meet them, not to reconnect, not to forgive, but to give them a taste of the discomfort they'd spent their lives avoiding. We met at a quiet cafe near the edge of town, the kind of place where nothing dramatic could happen without drawing stares. My mother looked older, thinner, her posture stiff like she was bracing for impact. My father looked tired in a way that went beyond sleep. They hugged me like I was a stranger they weren't sure had agreed to the hug. We sat. We ordered. We exchanged pleasantries that made my skin crawl. Then they asked it finally, haltingly, why I had written what I did. I looked them in the eye, steady and unblinking, and said the one thing I'd never dared to say before, because no one else was ever going to tell the truth. And I was done being the quiet one. They said nothing. Not a word. I left them there with their uneaten sandwiches and their downcast eyes, and as I walked away, I didn't feel triumphant or bitter or sad, I just felt free. Because now they knew. And they couldn't unknow it. It's a strange kind of justice when the people who spent years pretending your pain didn't exist finally feel the weight of it, not in the form of an angry confrontation or a tear-filled screaming match, but in the slow, persistent realization that the version of you they thought they knew was nothing more than a convenient fiction, a placeholder they could shape to fit their own comfort, and now that the mask has been ripped away, they're left sitting in the wreckage of their own delusions, wondering how they missed the storm brewing right in front of them. After that lunch, if you could even call it that, because nothing of substance was consumed or resolved, there was no dramatic fallout, no shouting in the parking lot or desperate apology as I turned to walk away. There was only quiet. Long, aching, shame-laced quiet. And, honestly, that silence did more than 1,000 apologies ever could, because it told me everything I needed to know. They finally understood that I wasn't coming back. Not really. Not to them. Not to the role they had always assigned me. The weeks that followed felt suspended in time, like I had stepped out of the rhythm of my own life and into a space where everything was still moving, but I no longer felt the need to chase any of it. The book was out. The podcast had run its course. People still messaged me, some asking for advice, others sharing their own stories of family betrayal and quiet revenge, and while I responded to as many as I could, I also began to pull back from the noise, not because I regretted what I had done, but because I had told the truth, loudly and publicly, and now I needed to reclaim a part of myself that existed beyond the telling of it. That's when Melissa reached out. The message came through a secondary email I had linked to the book's publicity tour, a short, tentative note from a woman who claimed to be my half-sister, someone I had never met, never even heard of, but who shared blood with me nonetheless. At first, I thought it was a prank. I stared at her name for several minutes before opening the attachment she'd sent, an old photo, scanned and faded, of a girl who looked just enough like me at 12 to send a chill down my spine. In the email, she explained that she had been born 2 years before me, the product of an affair my father had while engaged to my mother, and though she had been kept a secret for most of her life, she had recently discovered the truth through a DNA test her daughter had encouraged her to take. She hadn't expected much, maybe a medical history, maybe a name, but when she found mine, when she read my book and recognized the dates, the faces, the tone of voice that mirrored her own childhood confusion, she said she felt like a missing piece had finally clicked into place. And the truth is, I didn't even hesitate. I called her that same day, and within 20 minutes of hearing her voice, I knew she was telling the truth, not just because of the facts she laid out, but because there was something in the way she spoke. In the tentative but unflinching way she recounted her own story of abandonment, that made me feel like I was looking at a mirror held up to a different life, one that had unfolded in another town with different wallpaper and slightly different wounds, but the same emotional architecture. Meeting her in person was surreal, not because it felt forced or awkward, but because it didn't. We walked for hours, talking about everything from our childhood bedrooms to our parents' terrible communication skills to the way silence in a house full of people can sometimes feel louder than anything else in the world. She had been left behind too, not in the same way, not with the same set of expectations and performance-based love, but discarded nonetheless, pushed out of sight to make way for a family that never had room for the full story. It was like finding a long-lost ally in a war I didn't even realize had spanned generations, and while I didn't have the language for what we were building, sisterhood, friendship, mutual repair, it didn't really matter. We were showing up for each other now, and sometimes that's all that counts. Of course, the discovery of Melissa shattered whatever fragile narrative my parents were still trying to cling to. When I sent them a message, short and without explanation, simply saying, "I met Melissa. She's lovely. You should be ashamed," it didn't even occur to me that they might deny it. By that point, I think even they understood that the old ways of pretending things away had expired. They didn't respond. Not directly. But I heard through a third cousin that my father had stopped going to church, that my mother had pulled back from her garden club, that something in them had folded inward, like the truth had finally cornered them, and they no longer had the strength to lie their way out. But by then, I wasn't watching them anymore. I was watching myself. I had spent nearly 4 decades trying to be the daughter they could be proud of, the sibling who kept the peace, the one who never made things harder than they already were, even as I bled internally from the exhaustion of being invisible. And now, with my story told, with the silence finally ruptured, with a sister by my side and a future that was no longer defined by their limitations, I realized that I didn't need their recognition, their apology, or their love to validate who I had become. I had already outgrown the small, brittle version of myself they had tried to contain, and in doing so, I had become something they never expected, a woman they could no longer control. They say they miss me now. That's the word my mother uses when she speaks to family friends or when she leaves the occasional voicemail, "I never return." We miss Rachel. We just want things to go back to how they used to be. But the truth is, they don't miss me. They miss the version of me who stayed quiet, who showed up to birthday parties and brought gifts for a brother, who couldn't name my favorite book, who smiled politely through condescension and changed the subject when things got too real. They miss the daughter who existed for their comfort, not the woman who finally put her comfort first. And maybe that's the real tragedy, not that they failed me, not that they picked Caleb time and time again, not even that they turned their backs when I was sick, but that they never took the time to truly know me, to see beyond the role I was playing, to realize that I had a voice worth listening to long before I was forced to shout. I've stopped trying to make sense of it. Some stories don't end with reconciliation or redemption. Some just end with distance and clarity and a kind of peace that doesn't need to be explained. And maybe that's okay. Because sometimes, the loudest thing you can ever say to someone is nothing at all.